Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Gymdustries, or of Crisis Talks of Gymdustries. Hopefully the new setup was a success. From the feedback we've got, it seems to have been a reasonable improvement, and people can hear me a bit more clearly, and I am talking a bit more slowly. So this is the second video in our series on information. I think this is going to be a really interesting series by the time we get to the end of it, and I think people are probably going to quite like it, but it's going to take a more meandery path than the first series did. And you're just going to have to bear with me on that. I promise there's a point to all of this. Just stick with it. Which I suppose isn't the best advert for a YouTube video, but we do what we do. In T.H. White's love letter to Arthurian myth and legend, the once and future king, the newly crowned King Arthur is seduced by a woman called Morgause. She's a witch from Orkney in Scotland, and crucially is his aunt. Also crucially, he doesn't know that. This act of unknowing incest is the inciting incident in the tragedy of Arthur's tale. It is from this moment that Arthur, and so the land, is damned. Because from this union is born Mordred, who would many years later cause the end of the rule of the Round Table, and so plunge Arthur's granary back into chaos. Now, Arthur is ignorant of the sin that he committed, yet he's punished for it all the same. This is a crucial theme in many myths and folk stories. Oedipus ends up gouging out his own eyes over a similar indiscretion. The ignorant, tragic hero is a tale so old that authors from Sophocles to White thought that it was worth writing about. So why is this theme so pervasive in the stories that humans have constructed to tell ourselves? Well, I think the answer is quite simple. I think ignorance, be it willing or unwilling, has the potential to have devastating impact on our lives. Unwilling ignorance is like that of Arthur. When we do not possess the means to learn the information that is being kept from us, or when it is known by another who cannot or will not disclose it. Outside of myth and legend, this is commonplace in our modern world. There are dozens and dozens of organisations that are designed solely to keep information from people. This can be for entirely noble reasons. I shouldn't know my neighbour's bank account details, for example, and my personal details shouldn't be available online for all and sundry. However, there are many examples of powerful organisations like nations or churches withholding information in order to keep people unwillingly ignorant of certain facts. For example, in the UK, we have noticed that the metric by which we measure our deaths during the COVID pandemic has changed as the government neglected, or forgot, if you believe them, to include certain aspects like deaths in care homes or deaths in the community, or when the press has simply not reported or seriously underreported on a fact that should be widespread. The Office of National Statistics, the ONS, estimates that as a result of the austerity measures over the last 10 years, about 130,000 people have died in the UK. That's give or take the population of Exeter, for reference. If you're not from the UK and have no idea where Exeter is, I'm aware that that's useless information, but Exeter died. Tonight on the 6 o'clock news, the government kills the population of Exeter over the last 10 years. You would think that that statistic should be everywhere, and yet it's not. It would serve the interests of the state ill to publicise or widely publish that information. So, it goes underreported. And people are kept unwillingly ignorant of that statistic. The question we have to ask is whether or not access to that information would change people's opinions and maybe voting intentions. Because if it would, then the state has used its power and mechanisms in order to obstruct information and keep people unwillingly ignorant for its own benefits, and not for those noble ones I discussed earlier. Further to that, we will often see organisations try and justify immoral obstruction of information with seemingly moral reasons. This information is too dangerous for the public is a common one used in film tropes. However, when the state and media begin to demonise people calling for clarity as irresponsible or reckless, then that can become the community opinion on whistleblowers very quickly, thus making the job of a state keeping its population ignorant that much easier. So that's unwilling ignorance and a few of the plethora of issues that that can result in. But I mentioned willing ignorance earlier, and let's talk about that for a second. The Masque of the Red Death, bear with me, is a story written by Edgar Allan Poe. It is set in a country beset by an awful plague called, funnily enough, the Red Death. The tale follows a prince called Prospero, no awards for original naming here, who, in the midst of this terrible plague, invites 1,000 members of the country's aristocracy to reside in his lavish abbey. The attendants are electing to be willingly ignorant of the people suffering beyond their walls, despite the fact that the wealth they are frittering on this party could be used to help those most affected by the plague. They are choosing to turn a blind eye to the suffering of their fellow man. The nobility, however, have a proverbial wrench thrown in their plan when a mysterious masked stranger arrives at the ball and begins moving from room to room. Prospero confronts him and immediately dies of the Red Death. This spreads it to the rest of the party, and they also die shortly after. What a terrible shame. As a brief aside, Edgar Allan Poe is a pretty problematic figure to talk about in the modern era because he married his 13-year-old cousin. But the story is a really good example of willing ignorance, so we're going to use it here. The prince and his guests elected to be willingly ignorant of the suffering around them. This is when we possess the capacity to learn information, but decide not to. Now, this can be for noble and ignoble reasons. We can avoid learning about events that we may find traumatic, for example. If I've suffered from a house fire, I may wish to not learn about other house fires going on in the area. The problem again comes when we elect to be willingly ignorant of matters that might affect our or another's welfare. For example, let's take some published statistics of the number of homeless folks in our country. If the majority of our population ignore those of their own volition, the government of that country would have very little motivation to do something about the issue. This can be summed up as a not my problem attitude and is rife in individualist society. See, the early videos are still relevant. When discussing ignorance, it is important for us to remember that if a state or government can rely on a willingly ignorant population, a population that won't consume the information even when it's given, it doesn't have to do half as much work when it comes to obstructing or obscuring it. In a very real way, a willingly ignorant population does the work of an oppressive media for it. It can be hard, however, to stare at upsetting information, to consume depressing news in an already fairly depressing world. And this is where community comes into play. If we each agree to consume just a little bit more of that information, then we don't have to take on the full burden ourselves. If we as a collective decide to become more aware of the problems of our society, we can each take on a portion of those woes to be responsible for, and can avoid entirely having to take on the whole mass of issues that we face. The choice to be more conscious and less ignorant is a hard choice, but rarely is the right thing easy. Ignorance, be it willing or unwilling, can allow parties that do not have our best interests at heart to lead us astray. In the end, both varieties result in the same thing: deception. I think that if we are going to rail against organisations that withhold information from us, we have a responsibility to consume the information that is available. Otherwise, what's the point in demanding its release if nobody's going to read it? That's the ignorance video, folks. Ignorance is a difficult topic to talk about. Much like a lot of the things we address on this channel, it takes a certain level of introspection and admission of fault to discuss. They're not things that people find easy, and this is not meant as an accusation. We're all guilty of the same sins in many ways. I mean, not those of Arthur, but, other sins. And part of being a conscientious and thoughtful person is constantly re-examining those problems, or re-examining those shortcomings, let's say. Anyway, I hope this finds you well, and wherever you are in the world, stay safe. We really hope that you enjoyed that, and if you did, please feel free to like, comment and subscribe, because it's a huge benefit to the channel when you do.